One of the best afternoons I spent recently was in Ewing, New Jersey, the College of New Jersey, where I visited for the first time the David Sarnoff collection, where there's a very, very effective small museum. So it's with particular anticipation that I look forward to the presentation by Alex Magoun, who's the outreach historian at the IEEE History Center. He received his PhD in American history from the University of Maryland, and he studied there with the noted historian of technology, Robert Friedel, who was the founding director of the IEEE History Center. Alex is an expert on the history of television and was the director of the revived David Sarnoff Library, and he's the author of the book David Sarnoff Research Center, RCA Labs to Sarnoff Corporation, and also he's the author of Television, The Life Story of a Technology. Alex Magoun.
Thank you very much, Corey, and thank you all for coming here, and grazie principessa in your absence. Yes, we were told that this was because of Signor Marconi's work on his ship, that we should look at the space of invention. And this led me to thinking about, people work in labs, and I deal a lot, obviously, with industrial or corporate inventors, but it could apply to lone inventors. They're in a laboratory. Guglielmo is in the attic space of his father's estate at Ponte Vecchia outside Bologna, but he's also communicating outside that space. So I was sort of inspired to think of Virginia Woolf, going back to my brief time in English literature, this rather famous quote that was based on the fact that she realized her creative impulses were only unleashed when she received an annual bequest from an uncle's trust of 500 pounds that gave her the independence to be able to get away and write free of any economic strain. And I would suggest that this also applies to all creative people, whether you're an artist, a painter, a musician, and perhaps Principessa can consider this for her Bologna mansion, this mansion of many rooms, that perhaps it could be filled with not just people in STEM, but also people in digital media, the arts, music, all sort of working together. But I didn't know about that when I was putting this together, so I had three questions. Well, okay, a room of your own. How big is the room? Can you share it with anybody else? Do you stay isolated? And what is a room? Is it a physical space with four walls and a ceiling and a floor, or can we define it more broadly, more creatively? So we'll start with the only photo of a room outside of the state of New Jersey. This is David Sarnoff on the 53rd floor of the RCA building in Rockefeller Center, preparing for an address on NBC. And he always had a room of his own. He did have a room at the RCA laboratories in Princeton, New Jersey, but that was really sort of a ceremonial place. So let's go to see what some of his researchers that he directed in certain particular ways was, let's push beyond radio, let's add sight to sound, let's add movement to that sight, let's add moving images. And this is a photo of the room, the inventive space, on top of, I think this is Building 8 in the RCA Victor complex in Camden, New Jersey, where Randy Ballard, standing, and Les Flory are experimenting with an RCA-made version of Philo Farnsworth's image dissector tube. This was the first electronic tube that could do video, capture electronic video. And until these men and a bunch of the others under Vladimir Zworykin could develop a much more effective storage tube that could store the image between scans, the iconoscope, they experimented a little bit with the Farnsworth technology. Now, RCA was involved in a heck of a lot of projects, just as you'll find out from Dr. Hochheiser what Bell Labs staff were doing. And so you found that electronics and wireless technology, the phenomena of microwave radiation, could be applied to communications in sort of different ways. And in this case, it was with a modulated unpulsed radar. This is sort of continuous wave radar, which initially could show you that there was ships coming into New York Harbor from the Atlantic Highlands, where Ernst Linder, I missed the R there, Irving Wolfe, who was the leader for RCA in radar in 1934-37, and then George Leck is over there. You can see the tower, that's Camden. I think, what is it, the town hall or city hall? We wanted to keep this as New Jersey photos, so I don't have pictures of Philadelphia, but they also experimented on the Delaware River as well. But this was getting down to 9 centimeter, which is pretty impressive because they were using 10 centimeter at the beginning of World War II for the Battle of Britain. There are other things you need in that room, and one of them, when you're developing phosphors for your television picture tubes, is a furnace. So here is Humboldt Leverance, the member of the technical staff in Camden, gracefully receiving this white-hot little ceramic vial full of cooked selenium, which is the phosphors that provided some of the first white phosphors, the things that you see in your fluorescent tubes. It turned out this white phosphor was not just useful for black and white television, but General Electric had to license this for its fluorescent tubes, which were also making a breakthrough in the late 1930s. Leverance recalls that this furnace room was behind an auditorium in the building, so he had to walk along the side while people in the marketing division were making presentations about this year's line of radios in 1936-37. He would be carrying this extremely hot vial of phosphors up the side to get back to his office. There are other things you need in a room if you're a television engineer. It's kind of useful to actually have a television. That round white thing is basically the television picture tube, an early receiver, these experimental receivers in 1936. RCA went through 5 different field tests because when they were developing their television system, they understood this has to be a national system. You have to find out how it works with multiple channels, what the reception is in all sorts of environments, city, urban environments, rural environments, what is the interference patterns, what are the propagation patterns, what is the reception like with different types of antennas. You also need, if you're going to make the components of that system, especially these tubes, you need these vacuum chambers. So this box is the evacuation chamber for the camera tube, the iconoscope that Vladimir Zworykin and his team developed. And this was really the basis for modern electronic television. It's the hard part of the system. Everyone understands that, yes, we could have television, but there's always one obstacle that gets in the way of making that possible, and it's overcoming, finding a solution to that, a practical solution. And in this case, it was how do you make a picture tube? How do you make an imager, an electronic imager, practical imager that will store the image between the scans of this electron beam? There are other spin-off technologies. Once Zworykin had sort of set television on its way at RCA, he had sort of free reign. He was the director of the Electronics Research Lab, and he had married a second time to a doctor working out of Philadelphia who said, if you're so concerned about the commercialization of television as they've commercialized radio, why don't you work on helping doctors see what they can't see? And so he hired first a physicist from Belgium who developed an early electronic microscope, which really didn't work very well. And then he recruited James Hillier here, smoking the pipe while he tightens the vacuum seals. You can see clean room qualities are not always something to be desired here. But Hillier and his colleague up at the University of Toronto had built an electron microscope with sort of tin cans and baling wire for their PhD project. And they interviewed at both General Electric up in Schenectady and at RCA. And Hillier said that the difference was at General Electric they sort of talked about the fringe benefits and the time off you'll get and you'll be working on this. It wasn't very imaginative. When he got to Zworykin, who sort of quizzed him, and sort of found out what he'd been doing. And then Dworkin said in his thick Russian accent, "Can you build me an electron microscope I can sell in 6 months?" And that was the kind of challenge a young postdoc really loves. And they started in February. I think it was, he started on Valentine's Day, 1940. And within 6 months, they had sold his first electron microscope for $10,000. So this was all in Camden, and you can see the rooms were not necessarily very clean. They were sort of salvaged from the Victor Talking Machine Company, which had started on that site where you're not dealing with electronics, you're dealing with sawdust and metal dust from machining and fabricating. And there was a lot of push in the late 1930s to, we need to get these inventors, the really top quality people, out of the factory, away from the sort of research and development, or get their research out into a garden, the garden part of the state. And so they found this nice potato farm, which was being leased off of Route 1 in what is actually West Windsor, but RCA from the very beginning called it Princeton. And built this for $1 million. The last tenant farmer refused to leave until his lease was up, so that building stayed up in front. You can still see this. It's now part of SRI International as you drive between Harrison Street and Fisher Place on Route 1 South. And for a brief time in the late 1940s, they did have this nice neon light, which they wanted to raise into a broadcast experimental tower, and I think the people in West Windsor got a little upset with the commercialization of their farmland. You can also use, if you're working in sound, an anechoic chamber of your own. And I'm sorry the lighting is not very good here, but this is Dr. Harry Olson, who is best known for inventing the velocity microphone. It's the ribbon microphone, has a very flat response from very low frequencies to about 10,000 cycles per second, 10 kilohertz. And he wanted a space with no sound, where if you close the door with all this hanging horsehair and wool, you can smell the horse hides, and you can hear your own heartbeat. It's that quiet. But that's where you want to be able to test the propagation characteristics of microphones and loudspeakers. And to do this, sometimes you need an orchestra. So various people, engineers, are creative in a variety of ways, and many of them are musically inclined. And so these were various members of the acoustics laboratory and I think other parts of RCA Labs, including the fellow giving the Sieg Heil and the mustache. This being, let's beat Hitler in 1943. I should add that apparently, and maybe Sheldon can confirm or deny this, but the story was he was, RCA in its own little way competed with certain parts of Bell Laboratories, which was much bigger, and he insisted that this anechoic chamber be 1 inch on the dimensions larger than the one at Bell Labs, which had been constructed the year before.
I've been in the one at Bell Labs, but I didn't think to measure.
Now, there were other spaces. If you're going to do television research at a laboratory, it would help to have your own studio with, I assume this is maybe a mixture of acoustic and reflective tiling. This is right off of, there's a crossroads in the building that Paul has shown and the photographs between the east-west aisles, corridors, and the little north-south one. This is now a small little auditorium they use, but this is Al Schroeder testing television. Even though they had much more sensitive camera imagers than what Philo Farnsworth had initially pioneered with the image dissector, you can still see the size of these arc lamps that they wanted. Whether you have a CCD or a CMOS imager, more light is always better for the people doing the studio productions. Some of the other activities they worked on World War II were basically for the war effort. A huge issue in battle has been infection of wounds. How do you get rid of the death and incapacity of soldiers from their war wounds with infections? And so The big challenge, one of the challenges with refining penicillin is, fine, you grow this mold, but it's this wet, mooky, white stuff, right? How do you get the water out of it? How do you dry that penicillin so we can make those little pills and give them to people? And George Brown here with Cyril Hoyler to his right, and a technician, I've forgotten this individual's name, but they came up with, again, sort of using a form of low microwave radiation to basically, zap the penicillin and basically take out all of the moisture by basically freezing it and then, radiating it with intense microwave radiation to boil off the water vapor and give you these penicillin crystals. So you need this kind of cool technology, and fortunately, nobody seems to have saved any of those glass globes. There are times when you just need to sit at a bench. To be honest, the number of women at RCA and the research staff has always been very small. I believe I heard the laugh of one of them. There she is, Dr. Rebecca Mercuri. Was there in the 1980s and can attest to this. But they had a number of technicians who were working. It's basically a physiological fact that women do have finer motor skills than men. And if it wasn't for women, you wouldn't have all the vacuum tubes or the microprocessors and chips, because they're the ones that manage to not break them and screw them up when connecting them and putting them together. So here is a woman assembling something very fine with a variety of calipers and the light. You can notice in these lab rooms at the RCA Labs, this is in Princeton, they had a variety of electrical outlets. I mean, any sort of power you needed, AC, DC, different voltages, different amperages, you could plug into and set up. And then remember we said add sight to sound, and sort of that initial step was how do you fax? And RCA, working with General Electric and other companies, was pioneering in wireless facsimile in the 1920s. And there's a fellow, Jonathan Coopersmith, whose book on the history of fax, which is this curious story of a technology that came out just a few years after Samuel Morse's telegraph. People were already saying, how can we use this to send images in the 19th century? And the question, is how come it took so long for fax to finally become a commercially successful technology? Well, RCA was in the midst of this. This is their electrofax machine, and you can see you need a room, a very large room, to pull out your electrofax printed sheet and try to find out what's going on with the printer and so forth. So it helps to have a fax machine of your own as well. RCA worked on, we've been hearing about Google cars and so forth. Well, RCA was one of those organizations that did a lot of these things well ahead of time. And in this case, it was wireless cars. You may have forgotten, before we all had seat belts and airbags and so forth, that between 50 and 60,000 Americans died every year in traffic accidents. It was a particularly violent era with large, solid cars which have lots of mass, and when they collide with something, they don't crumple and you go right through them. So the idea here was you could have little radio frequency reflectors and so forth that could guide the equipment in the car and follow at a distance. And they built their own racetrack. They collaborated with General Motors on this in the late 1950s. And then they actually followed it up in the 1970s doing further microwave transducers and emitters that helped lead to the Easy Pass technology, actually, because you had sensors emitting basically radar from the car, bouncing off of license plates and so forth. Now, to do all of this research, it helps to have a library. It helps to have a little quiet space. So they had these carrels. This is the new library in 1958. You can see, because they're, it's a carrel of his own, but unfortunately you can see the guy looking at him, which is kind of, I think, distracting if you're looking up and musing, and all of a sudden you see this guy down there. So later they filled that with books and bound periodicals. Now, RCA was more than the central laboratory. They spun off this astroelectronics to develop first sort of video from space. The Tyros satellites were given IEEE milestones at Princeton and at InfoAge, where Prince Bessa will visit on, I believe, Monday. This was the challenge of calibrating the camera outdoors. This is Max Messner, the engineer, sort of setting up with the chart and checking out the camera with all the solar cells on the outside to do this. But RCA worked quite a bit in communications and in imaging satellites, both for communications and for various types of reconnaissance. The Tyros weather satellite was actually designed to take pictures, which happened to give you the benefit of seeing if there were hurricanes. It also told the people running the reconnaissance satellite coming up behind it when the reconnaissance satellite should open its camera and take photos and not waste it on clouds over the Soviet Union. So a kind of a dual-use technology. Now, as you develop into light wave technologies, moving beyond microwaves, RCA jumped into this. It was the high-tech the hot technology for young postdocs in the 1960s is if you were working on lasers, that was a new field to develop. So you are now about to see a number of Italian-American descendants of RCA in particular. This is Robert Bartolini, young Robert Bartolini with his sunglasses, working in the basement of the David Sarnoff Research Center in Princeton with this green laser, which is reading or embossing this tape. It was basically a two-dimensional hologram like you have on your credit card. And they had a reel of these, and this is what you were going to watch as a videotape, was you would have a home laser reader system in your television set watching movies and so forth on pre-laser beamed videotapes. And they had whole ways to press these and print these. And they did one demo of this in 1969 and then put the demo machine behind the auditorium screen, and nobody saw it until it got moved to Ewing 4 years ago, where it may come out, we hope, for a future exhibit. And then if you wanted to get away from those big, bulky picture tubes, right from the early start of commercial success for television, all the men designing these technologies understood that their wives were, happy with television, but they really wish that box didn't take up so much room in their living room. And it would be really nice if you could have something you could hang on the wall like a picture frame. And so in 1951, when David Sarnoff was celebrating 45 years in the industry, he made one of his 3 50th anniversary requests to his researchers was, give me a technology that can amplify light and basically put the picture on the wall. And it took a long time, and this is Lou Zanoni was the brilliant technician working with George Heilmeyer and Joe Castellano after Dick Williams had first conceived of the LCD. He's the fellow that figured out how do you actually make the device. It's all very well to say it's going to be addressed this way electronically and the voltages, but how do you actually fabricate the glass to hold the liquid crystals in the right alignment, the chemical alignment, so they can rotate and twist or flip or whatever they need to do to allow light to pass or not pass. And then you come back to microwaves. This is Robert Paglione and the turkey roll cooker. You may not know that RCA was working on ways to mass-produce turkey roll. You may not even be aware that in 1941, RCA was working on ways to, quick cook pork roll for tailors in Trenton using radio frequencies instead of, roasting them in gas, mass industrial gas ovens. This radio stuff would be much more clean and efficient. This later effort came out of the fact that they bought, as part of their diversification campaign, what became Banquet frozen foods. You're going to offset dips in your profits from semiconductors or television set sales with frozen foods. And then Banquet said, well, what are you guys doing for us? We're contributing to the maintenance of the laboratories. And they said, well, we can help you with turkey roll. We need mass cooking of this with microwave technology. And Paglione told me, I asked him what happened to this equipment, and he said, well, it got put into great big crates and shipped down to Louisville, Kentucky, and that's the last we heard of it. And we've kind of skipped over, I didn't really have a good picture of color television research, but we should remember that New Jersey is actually the site, not just of, by and large, electronic black and white television, but color electronic television, the thing that we're still enjoying today, was also invented in the labs. And there were issues about how do you make this a global phenomenon, how do you transmit these signals from one coast to another or from one continent to another. And so in the 1970s, we're back on the rooftop, up on the roof here at the David Sarnoff Research Center with Lou Stetz and Joe Zenel. Those of you who still have Dish Network or something and those little dishes, just be glad you don't have to have those 15-foot dishes in your backyard. And if you're doing military work, which RCA had a very large defense electronics division in working out of Camden after the consumer electronics moved, the production moved west and south, and the research moved up to Princeton by and large. They expanded into Moorestown, and you can still see the so-called cruiser in the cornfield between routes 295 and the New Jersey Turnpike. This is where the Aegis missile defense system or air defense system, the radar system was invented. It was RCA's biggest military contract and project, and it was $5 billion, which meant a lot of money in the 1970s and 1980s. And now the military, and I think Lockheed Martin owns this particular establishment now, and they're busy selling it to various American allies and continuing to refine it. And this radar display here sort of shows it has very wide, very consistent distribution and propagation. And I'm going to conclude here well outside the laboratory. And again, this is somewhat ironic. It's an example of wireless communications. It's the phenomenon of wireless that Marconi pioneered is not just limited to cell phones and so forth. This microwave radiation, RCA was one of the organizations pioneering the research of hyperthermia. How can you precision burn out a brain tumor in this case? You do have to open up the skull, but now you have these very small probes, and you can just get rid of the tumor cells and not the healthy cells next door. So I'm going to conclude with that thought, and thank you all for listening and welcome any questions.